Christopher Nolan has spent his entire career exploring one central question. What happens when extraordinary people are forced to live with extraordinary choices? Whether it's Leonard Shelby trying to reconstruct his memories in Memento, Bruce Wayne sacrificing his identity in The Dark Knight, Cobb confronting his guilt in Inception, Cooper choosing between his family and humanity in Interstellar, or Oppenheimer grappling with the consequences of changing history. Nolan's protagonists are never simply fighting an external enemy, they're wrestling with themselves. That's exactly why, in my eyes, The Odyssey feels like such a natural fit for him. Now, a lot of people are aware that The Odyssey is one of the oldest adventure stories ever written. It's a story about a hero fighting monsters, gods, witches, and impossible odds just to return home after the Trojan War. But for Nolan's retelling of this classic story, he decided to strip away the idea that it's simply an epic quest. Instead, he transforms Homer's poem into something far more intimate. This isn't just about getting home, it's a story about whether someone can ever truly return after everything they've done. The film challenges its audience by posing this haunting question, and that being, if war changes you completely, can you ever become the person your loved ones have been waiting for? That's why I think The Odyssey works on so many levels. Yes, it's filled with incredible spectacle. The Cyclops sequence is terrifying. Circe's island is one of the most unsettling things Nolan has ever directed. The journey into the Underworld feels like you're stepping into a nightmare. But beneath all that is a deeply human story about guilt, identity, grief, and forgiveness. So in this breakdown, I really wanted to share my thoughts about my experience with this film and break down the story, discuss Nolan's biggest changes from Homer's original poem. We're going to be exploring the deeper symbolism, examining the Greek mythology that inspired these moments, and explain why I believe only Christopher Nolan could have made this version of the Odyssey. After spending the last week with this film, I don't think Nolan made a movie about defeating monsters, but he really made a movie about confronting the monster you've become. So with that said, obviously there will be massive spoilers for The Odyssey, so if you haven't seen the film yet or read the poem that it's based on or other interpretations of the story, this is your warning. Now with that out of the way, let's set sail and break down Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. One of the smartest creative decisions Nolan makes early on in the opening sequences happens before we even see Odysseus. Most adaptations begin with the hero, but this time around, Nolan begins with the people he left behind, which completely changes our perspective of this story. Instead of immediately immersing us in the mythological creatures and battles, we're introduced to Ithaca as a kingdom suspended in grief. The palace is still standing, the throne is still there, and life technically continues, but emotionally, time has stopped. Penelope continues to refuse every suitor. Telemachus has grown up in the shadow of the father he barely remembers. Even Eumaeus claims to the hope that Odysseus is still alive, despite everyone around him insisting otherwise. If I'm being honest, the opening and a lot of the first 15 or 20 minutes or so to me was a bit jarring because it felt like a lot of exposition being thrown to us in regards to getting into the story and catching the audience up to where the story actually begins. But after thinking about the opening, I now think of it as this incredibly important way to reframe the story. Rethinking about the opening, I thought to myself, what's the central question Nolan is setting up? It's not necessarily can Odysseus survive, it's really what happens to an entire family and an entire kingdom when hope slowly turns into a memory. It's actually brilliant because it's that emotional foundation that absolutely gives every scene later so much more weight. By the time Odysseus begins his journey home, we've already understood what's waiting for him and, more importantly, what he stands to lose. Nolan also uses the opening to establish another major idea that runs throughout the film, and that being the importance of what the Greeks called xenia, which is a sacred Greek law of hospitality. In ancient Greek culture, welcoming strangers wasn't just considered polite, but it was believed to be a commandment from Zeus himself, as they referred to in the film as Zeus's law. To mistreat a guest wasn't just as simple as being rude in today's society or by today's standards, but it's here that it's actually an act against the gods. Now it's clear as we meet these suitors that they're openly mocking this belief. We can see that they are exploiting Penelope's generosity by consuming Odysseus' wealth as they slowly strip Ithaca of its values it once stood for. It's so interesting to see how Nolan managed to inject some of the societal things that we see in today's society regarding how we as people have become morally bankrupt. Looking at the suitors, on the surface it's easy to place them as the antagonists trying to seize power, but going back to what Nolan is saying, to me, symbolically, they represent a society that has begun abandoning its moral foundation. It's that right there that becomes one of the film's quiet tragedies. Odysseus isn't returning to a home he left behind, but he's returning to a world that's forgotten the very principles he's fought to protect. You know, one of my criticisms on my first watch was my lack of being fully committed to the performance in the journey of Telemachus played by Tom Holland. Now, by no means did I think he was awful, it was just that I didn't find a lot of his inclusion to the story to be as engaging or compelling. But it was interesting to see how much emphasis Nolan placed on him pretty early on and honestly throughout the rest of the movie. Now, from some of, not all adaptations I have seen, I personally don't recall Telemachus functioning as a primary lead, but more as a supporting character. But to me, I found him to be in many ways the second protagonist of the movie. I mean, his journey basically mirrors his father's in many ways. You have Odysseus who's trying to find a way home, while Telemachus is trying to discover who his father truly is, which obviously puts them on two completely different journeys. When Telemachus leaves Ithaca to seek answers from Menelaus, Nolan uses these scenes to explore what it means to inherit someone else's legacy. We can see throughout the first act that Telemachus has spent his entire life listening to stories about a legendary king, his father, but stories are different from reality. Every tale presents Odysseus as a mythic hero, a man of unmatched intelligence and courage, but not to jump too far ahead to the end, but the irony is that by the end of the film, Telemachus discovers that his father isn't defined by those legends. He's defined by his flaws, his guilt, and his willingness to keep moving forward despite them. Now, despite my issues with the character's journey and some of the performances at points, it really is a moment when you come to realization, at least for me, of seeing this transformation of Telemachus being someone searching for a hero into someone capable of becoming a leader himself. And man, talk about an interesting relationship between a father and his son and how it all comes full circle by how this story ends. And that's why the ending to me landed so perfectly, which we'll talk about much later in this breakdown. But the story was just never about Odysseus reclaiming a kingdom and his throne, but it's really about preparing the next generation to lead it. Now, I do want to backtrack here and really focus on the suitors and how they function and their purpose in this story. Again, it's really easy to see them as the generic antagonists, but I really like how Nolan gives them more symbolic function. Now, they're clearly just a bunch of opportunists who thrive in the absence of leadership. Every single day Odysseus remains gone, they grow stronger, they eat his food, they occupy his palace, manipulate his servants, and pressure Penelope into surrendering. To me, they almost act and function as a form of parasites feeding on uncertainty. But looking at what Nolan was saying about them and how that idea of them extends beyond Ithaca, throughout history, power vacuums invite those willing to exploit them. Nolan uses the suitors as a reminder that when good leadership disappears, corruption often fills the void. That brings us to Antiochus, who was played incredibly by Robert Pattinson, who I personally think is the best in his age group of actors in playing characters with such talent, and I can go on and on about him as an actor, but he embodies the character who's someone with ambition, but without honor. He's charismatic, calculating, and willing to exploit anyone, including Melanto, who I completely forgot was going to be played by the great Mia Goth. Seriously, Christopher Nolan said, give me everyone in Hollywood, but Antiochus uses her to achieve his goals. His conspiracy to eliminate Telemachus reveals that he isn't just seeking a crown, but he's really trying to erase the rightful future of Ithaca altogether. Now, we've discussed Telemachus' purpose to finding his father, but the actual visit to Menelaus and Helen served as yet another important purpose to the themes that this film is tackling. These moments show us that everyone remembered the Trojan War much differently. Now, for some, it was a glorious victory, but for others, it was the beginning of the endless suffering. The conversations we see between these characters really highlight some of the recurring themes that we see throughout the story. Those burning the histories aren't objective, it's shaped by memory, perspective, and guilt. Odysseus has become a legend, but legends rarely tell the whole truth. Okay, let's take a moment to reflect and talk about one of the film's most insanely powerful and important sequences. Now, I would say regardless on if you've read The Odyssey or not, I think we could agree that at least most people are at least somewhat familiar with the basics of the story of the Trojan Horse, but it's watching Nolan's perspective that I found to be quite breathtaking. Traditionally, it's celebrated as one of the history's greatest military strategies. Odysseus devised a plan, the Greeks hide inside the wooden horse, the Trojans unknowably bring it into the city, and Troy falls. But leave it to Nolan to come at this from a different and more human and tragic perspective that doesn't present it as a glorious triumph. His way of showing this was so emotionally satisfying to the overall experience because he presents it as almost like humanity's original moral compromise. First off, the sequence happens and it's filled with incredible dread and tension. Plus, you have Hoytema's cinematography, which keeps you in the interior of the horse, which feels so claustrophobic, and you feel like you're shoulder to shoulder with the soldiers inside of the horse. Now, for copyright reasons, I can't play the score, but Ludwig Göransson's score perfectly captures the dread as well. When the gates finally open and we see the Greeks pour into Troy, and the way Nolan shoots this in a way that didn't frame the massacre as this heroic moment of spectacle, but it's how the camera lingered on the terrified civilians, the burning houses, and the innocent lives caught in the chaos, really just showcasing how victory comes at an unbearable cost. This entire sequence is the moment that truly and fundamentally changes how we as an audience will be viewing Odysseus from here on out. In this moment, he's not viewed as this clever hero warrior who outsmarted his enemies, but in my eyes, he's viewed as the architect of a strategy that forever altered his understanding of himself, as he broke the law that he stood by, which is breaking Zeus's law by going into someone's house and betraying them. This is where Nolan really plants the emotional seed that grows throughout the rest of the film. Odysseus wins the war, but in doing so, he loses the certainty that he is a righteous man, which is such a fascinating inversion of the typical hero's journey because the victory is only the beginning of the punishment. Everything that follows, the Cyclops, Circe, Poseidon's wrath, the Underworld, even the ending, all can be viewed as the external manifestations of the guilt born in Troy. Even looking at how the sea is used as an obstacle that isn't just to separate Odysseus from home, it becomes the physical representation of the emotional distance between the man he was and the man he's become. This being another example of what makes The Odyssey feel unmistakably like a Christopher Nolan film. By the end of the Trojan War, Odysseus has already achieved what most heroes spend the entire story trying to accomplish. He won. The war is over. The journey back home should be easy, but as we would see, it's not. Nolan turns the return home into something I will never forget seeing on the big screen for the first time, and even though I have been a fan of his work for years now, I didn't know that he had this in him, both as a director but also as a writer. Every island, every monster, every god becomes another layer of Odysseus' psychological unraveling. Nolan takes each one of these important steps and blends them all together into one continuous emotional descent as each one strips something away from Odysseus. Whether it be his confidence, then his certainty, and then his men, but eventually even his identity. Now, it was at this point in the film where I was completely locked in. Like, I was really enjoying the story, enjoying the journey, even with the first act maybe being the weakest to me. But here's the moment where everything changed. If there was one sequence that I believe will stick with most people and leave them buzzing after they've seen this film, it is the encounter with Polyphemus, also known as the Cyclops. Hands down, it's visually one of two of the most terrifying scenes that Christopher Nolan has ever directed. The other one we'll talk about later. The scale of the cave was just so overwhelming, especially seeing this in IMAX for both us, the audience, but also Odysseus's men. The way Hoytsema shot the cavern, it was like a gothic cathedral, and it made all the men inside look so tiny, like little ants, and looked like they were so insignificant. From the massive stone pillars that disappeared into the darkness, it was just so beautifully terrifying. But the best part of it all was how Nolan took a page out of Steven Spielberg's book and he pulled the Jaws method by deliberately withholding a full look at the Cyclops. The lead up was so perfect because we hear him before we even see him with his heavy footsteps and the echoing breaths. Now, one of the MVPs, or the unsung hero of the film in my eyes, was the incredible sound design, especially in this sequence because it almost does just as much work as the visuals do. But when the Cyclops finally emerges, it felt primal and ancient and more like a force of nature than something that can be defeated. What makes the sequence so effective wasn't just the danger, or at least to me it wasn't, it was the helplessness. It's the moment where, unlike Troy, Odysseus can't outfight his enemy, but he has to outthink him. I always remember him being defined as an incredible warrior, but also one of his most important traits throughout both the mythology and even this film is that his greatest weapon was never really his power or strength. He never really overpowered anyone to defeat them. Instead, he would use his intelligence. But, as we all know, something that most intelligent people have is that they suffer from having big egos and having a hard time to put away their pride. Now, it is here where Odysseus' ego trumps his smarts, as after figuring out a way to make it out of this cave with his men, most of them surviving, he decides to blind the Cyclops, and this would become one of the film's most major moral crossroads. Now, in the moment, it was maybe a smart tactical decision, but it also triggers catastrophic consequences because the Cyclops also happens to be the son of Poseidon, who happens to be the god of the sea, which is the only way back home for Odysseus and his men. Odysseus and most of the men, like I mentioned, survive the monster as they board their ships, but in doing so, they have awakened something far more dangerous, which is the wrath of a god. Poseidon is the invisible villain in Nolan's story, which I know some people were probably upset or disappointed that they didn't get to see a physical appearance from him, but for me, not seeing him actually made it more terrifying. We don't see Poseidon standing in front of Odysseus throwing lightning bolts or delivering these very lengthy speeches. Instead, Poseidon becomes almost omnipresent. Every storm, every crashing wave, every destroyed ship, every death at sea, they're just reminders that Odysseus can never truly escape what happened in Troy. It's almost like the water in the ocean becomes a villain within itself. And just thinking about something like, I don't know, Avatar, The Way of Water, or any film or story, a matter of fact, that deals with ocean and waters as characters of sorts, mostly they're framed as usually being associated with life and freedom. But here, water in the ocean is presented as a prison. Odysseus isn't sailing across the sea, he's trapped inside it. From one giant to another, this is where Odysseus and his men come across a race of cannibalistic giants known as the Laestrygonians. The attack by the giants is one of the film's most chaotic action sequences. We see the ships being torn apart, his men getting chopped down, and some disappear beneath the waves. It was brutal, but yet again, what's the story beneath this moment? This is an example of another recurring idea of how violence never ends when you think it does. Every victory that Odysseus has, it just simply creates another enemy. Every battle creates another survivor seeking revenge. The Greeks believe that they have finished their war at Troy, but no, they've only entered another one. This is Nolan suggesting that war isn't confined by battlefields, but its consequences that follow the soldiers home. Sometimes those consequences follow them forever. Now, speaking of forever, this was the other terrifying scene I mentioned earlier, and that is easily one of Christopher Nolan's greatest horror sequences of his career. If I had to choose one sequence that perfectly combines Christopher Nolan's filmmaking strength with pure horror, it would be the Circe scene. This was my favorite scene in the movie because it felt unlike anything Nolan has ever directed before. Everything about this scene felt so unsettling. First, the island appeared peaceful, but almost too peaceful. Then we have the eerie silence that's hanging over every frame that immediately lets us know that something isn't right. And then we discover the missing men, or whether what they have become. Ladies and gentlemen, watching Circe transform Odysseus' soldiers into pigs was extremely disturbing, but as a lifelong fan of horror, I loved every second of it. What I loved the most about the sequence was the practical makeup effects, which were incredible and definitely will get some Oscar nominations when it comes that time of the year. But also going back to my horror roots, this scene reminded me so much of the incredible scene in American Werewolf in London. That scene in American Werewolf in London is still one of the greatest practical transformation scenes that I've ever seen and I think has ever been put to film. That sequence was created by the legendary special makeup effects artist Rick Baker, whom groundbreaking work completely changed what audiences thought was possible with practical effects. Baker spent months developing mechanical prosthetics, extending facial appliances, the body rigs to create a transformation that looked so damn real. It was so revolutionary that his work on the film earned him the very first Academy Award for Best Makeup when the category was introduced in 1982. I apologize for my little horror side quest there. I'm such a big fan of the genre. I'm such a big fan of that film. And again, practical effects. And the reaction that I had seeing the American Werewolf in London transformation for the first time was very similar to my reaction to watching this scene in The Odyssey. Nolan just understands that there's something about practical effects that CGI just still struggles to replicate. When actors are physically interacting with real prosthetics and makeup, the transformation feels tangible, it feels grotesque and believable in a way that instantly immerses you into the scene. Now look, I can go on and on and on about how perfect that scene was and how much I loved it, but as we discussed thus far, the question is, what's underneath the horror, right? It isn't just the grotesque visuals, it's what's the question, what's the theme, what's the symbolic nature of this moment? Which brings us to the question, why does Circe turn Odysseus' men into pigs? Because it wasn't random for her to do that. As she reveals what war has already done to these men, they've become driven by instinct, violence, survival, and consumption. Their humanity has slowly disappeared long before they reached her island. All she did was merely make the transformation visible. That is why I think this sequence is one of the smartest pieces of symbolism in the film. She isn't creating monsters, she's exposing them. But it's here that we see Nolan makes a change from many of the other adaptations, and that's the dynamic between Odysseus and Circe. Rather than portraying this as a straightforward battle between a hero and a villain, it becomes an encounter between two people who understand suffering differently. We have Circe. She sees mankind as fundamentally flawed. And then you look at Odysseus. He still believes that redemption is possible, and looking at both sides, neither are entirely wrong. That's what makes their conversation so compelling on top of two incredible performances in the scene. Now, ultimately, Circe restores the men because she realizes something is different about Odysseus, as his determination isn't driven by glory anymore, but instead, he's driven by guilt. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a fan of Christopher Nolan, I'm a student of his films, and with saying that, I can't think of a stretch of sequences that were so perfect, from following the Cyclops sequence into the giants, into Circe, into this next scene that we're about to break down here. Like, all those scenes have a purpose, they're terrifying, they're dreadful, but it go back to the story, right? We go back to our guilt that we're seeing Odysseus is facing right now, which brings us to the emotional core of the film. If Troy is the film's beginning, the Underworld is its soul. Everything before this point has been a physical threat, but now the journey becomes much more psychological. Now, after Circe told Odysseus where to go next, which is crossing Oceanus, which takes us to the world, which felt almost dreamlike or more like a nightmare. The lighting becomes cold and desaturated, and the underworld presents itself as a place haunted by memories. It's here that the blind prophet delivers one of the film's most devastating truths. Only Odysseus will make it home. Now let's step back and think about that for a second. Imagine carrying that knowledge, because now moving forward, every decision afterward for him, it suddenly becomes so tragic. From here on out, every conversation that he has with his men carry this invisible weight, but more importantly, Odysseus isn't just trying to save them anymore, he's really only trying to delay the inevitable. Now that leads us to Sinon. We open the film with Sinon, who convinced the Trojans to bring the horse into the city, but died in the process of convincing them to doing so. Sinon now serves as guilt personified, reminding Odysseus that victory came through deception, as Odysseus would see his sacrifice as necessary. And that's exactly what haunts Odysseus. He realizes leadership often requires sacrificing others, but living with those sacrifices becomes something else entirely. But then comes the appearance of Agamemnon, who extends one of the film's biggest themes. Agamemnon won his war and thought that he would return home with arms being open, filled with joy, but no. Instead, he was murdered by the family he believed he was returning home to, which in return is the revelation that planted doubt inside Odysseus' mind. You have to imagine Odysseus is thinking, will Penelope still love him? Will Ithaca even remember him? Can home survive 20 years without him? Suddenly, this journey home becomes just as frightening as staying away. One of the more haunting moments happens here as Odysseus and his remaining men are chased by ghosts of their own army, chased by their memories. This was the moment that actually made my own connections to Oppenheimer. Just as Oppenheimer could never escape the consequences of creating the atomic bomb, Odysseus cannot escape the consequences of leading thousands of men into war. Nolan has always been fascinated by protagonists haunted by the choices only they had the power to make. Here's where choosing between two impossible outcomes hits Odysseus. The journey continues with metaphor in Greek mythology. Scylla or Charybdis? Lose a few men or lose everyone? There isn't a correct answer, only the least terrible one. This reflects leadership itself. Sometimes leadership isn't choosing between good or bad, it's choosing between bad or worse. That's why Odysseus carries so much guilt. Every life lost feels like a personal failure, even when no better outcome existed. Which leads us into guilt forming into the voice of temptation. This is where Nolan makes another change by presenting the Sirens differently than other adaptations. We don't get to fully see the beautiful women who are known to luring sailors with songs, but it's here that they become manifestations of longing. I absolutely love how it's revealed that everyone hears something different. Some hear their loved ones, others hear promises of peace, whereas Odysseus hears home. Which to me makes them so much more dangerous. Like the Sirens don't tempt you by giving you what you want, as we've seen in many depictions of them before, but here they tempt you with what you've lost, making it where the only way to survive is to resist looking backwards, another recurring idea throughout this brilliant film. Another thing that absolutely struck me about this scene was the score that is titled on the soundtrack Sirens, which at this point I've listened to 1,000 times. Again, not only the performances are sensational, the cinematography, the themes and metaphors, but then you're hit with score, which just makes a scene like this come full circle. But after enduring some of the most impossible tasks and challenges, this is where his men make the greatest mistake. Everything has been building towards this moment. Odysseus has warned them. The blind prophet warned them. The gods warned them. Do not touch the sacred cattle, but they're starving, they're exhausted, they're broken. All things that make their choices understandable, and that's exactly why this scene is so interesting. As we see the crew doesn't kill the cattle because they're evil, they do it because they're human. Survival outweighs faith. For one brief moment, they convince themselves that the necessity justifies the act. It's here that Nolan isn't necessarily judging them in this moment of weakness, but he asks us the difficult question instead, and that being, would any of us really have made a different choice? It's here where the punishment is immediate. The sea erupts, the storms feel almost biblical, lightning tears across the sky, ships are ripped apart one by one, every remaining member of Odysseus' crew is dead. The prophecy is fulfilled. Odysseus survives, but he's alone. Not because he was stronger, not because he was smarter, because surviving has become his punishment. By the end of this chapter, Odysseus has lost everything. His fleet, his friends, his soldiers, his certainty, his purpose. The legendary king of Ithaca has become nothing more than a man drifting across an endless ocean. Nolan slows everything down at this point in the story because after surviving every physical challenge imaginable, the greatest obstacle Odysseus has left is himself, as it is time to confront the man he has become. It is at this point that we get to spend a little bit more time with Calypso, who's played by Charlize Theron, as we learn that her paradise has become Odysseus' prison. Nolan's interpretation of Calypso is interesting because he completely avoids making this feel like a traditional romance. It actually kind of becomes one of the saddest parts of the movie. When Odysseus washed ashore, he physically is alive, but emotionally, he's broken. After spending years fighting monsters, watching his friends die, and believing the gods have cursed him, he's finally offered peace, or at least something that looks like peace. Nolan uses the lotus flower as both a magical plant that erases memory, but also as a form of escape. Forget the war, forget the guilt, forget the people you lost, forget the promises you made, forget who you are. And when you think about it, that temptation is probably more dangerous than any of the monsters and creatures. It's simple if you think about it, because monsters can kill you, but the lotus asks you to stop caring whether you live at all. Taking a moment to unpack that and thinking about Nolan's filmography and how he has explored characters' memories throughout his career. Think about Memento, Inception, and even Interstellar. The thing about memories is that they shape our identity. Without them, who are we? And that's exactly what's happening at this point in the story. Odysseus begins forgetting Troy, Penelope, Telemachus, and even Ithaca itself. He even begins losing himself. He's no longer the king of Ithaca. He's just another man drifting through existence. Now, depending on the person, one may consider Calypso as the bad person, but Nolan doesn't portray her in that way, in my opinion. I personally saw her as a lonely individual who, in her own way, cared for Odysseus and believed helping him forget his pain was an act of mercy. But Odysseus understands that forgetting his suffering would also mean forgetting his family, his purpose, and himself. This is the film's way of asking whether healing comes from escaping pain or learning to live with it, as Nolan's answer to me was pretty clear, and that is healing begins by remembering even when it hurts. Now, after monsters and battles and supernatural horrors, Christopher Nolan reduces the story to one man building a raft. Odysseus is no longer trying to defeat or outsmart anyone, he's simply choosing to move forward. As we come to the last half of the film, this is where Odysseus finally makes it home and he reaches Ithaca. Now, you'll notice something interesting here, and that is that there's no triumphant score, there's no huge celebration, no sweeping victory, but instead, Hoytema's cinematography of Ithaca almost felt like a memory. It's warm, it's quiet, almost melancholy. It's here that Odysseus realizes something before anyone else does. Home continued without him. The place is familiar, but it isn't the same, and neither is he. The reunion with Eumaeus might not receive as much attention as Argos or Penelope, but it is extremely important. Eumaeus never stopped believing. Everyone else accepted Odysseus' death, but Eumaeus didn't. Faith becomes one of the other recurring themes throughout the final act, and that is faith in family, faith in hope, faith that people can still return. Now, Odysseus decides to temporarily go by the name of Sinon, which at first may seem a bit odd. Like, why would he take the identity of the man whose sacrifice helped destroy Troy? Well, it's because Odysseus still sees himself through guilt. He's hiding behind the deception that started his emotional downfall. It's almost as though he didn't believe he's worthy of calling himself Odysseus anymore. Only after confronting everything he's done can he reclaim his own name. But before moving on, y'all, I gotta talk about what I consider to be the most emotional scene in the movie, and that being the scene that just completely broke me. It's the one where it involves no monsters, no action, no dialogue, really. It's just an old dog recognizing his best friend. Nolan just understands something that a lot of filmmakers forget when they have a story of such epic proportional scale, and that being that emotion doesn't come from dialogue, it comes from restraint. As we watch, the camera lingers, the score softens, almost everything surrounding this moment becomes silent as Argos simply looks at Odysseus, and Odysseus finally allows himself to break emotionally as we watch his dog dies peacefully. It's not because the dog was sad and had a broken heart, it's because he waited and his purpose was fulfilled. Let me tell y'all something, man. It's easily one of the most heartbreaking scenes that I have seen from Christopher Nolan. As someone like myself who has an older dog by the name of Thor, this scene, just like I mentioned, destroyed me. Its absence is something universal, and that being the fear that our pets won't be with us forever, and the hope that the people or animals who love us most will still recognize us no matter how much we've changed. Now, after the death of Odysseus' dog, we get this really beautiful moment, and that is a son realizing that he isn't just interacting with some traveler who saved his life, it's his father. And what I loved about this moment is that Nolan avoids the melodrama. He doesn't treat this like some giant Hollywood reunion. It actually kind of feels a little bit awkward and almost uncomfortable because if you think about it, these two men are strangers to each other, basically. Yes, they're related by blood, but they've never truly known one another. And honestly, that makes their growing relationship far more rewarding. But speaking of rewarding, we get to the Penelope scene, and we know that she never stopped believing. Perhaps maybe the strongest performance in the movie comes from Penelope, who was played beautifully by Anne Hathaway. She spent nearly the entire film just waiting, not passively, but actively. Every day she refuses another suitor. Every day she protects Ithaca. Every day she keeps hope alive. Just an incredible act of courage. Which courage is seen here in one of the biggest scenes, which is a confessional scene. And I think it's one of Nolan's biggest changes, which comes from the story, and that's Odysseus confesses everything. It's here that Odysseus confesses that he has become the very monster that Greece fears. He admits the Trojan Horse wasn't simply brilliant, but it was morally devastating. He confesses that the victory came at the expense of innocent lives. That guilt has followed him every single day since. The scene definitely looks like it's coming from a lens of forgiveness, but it's actually about telling the truth. For the first time, Odysseus stops pretending that he was the perfect hero. And with that revelation comes one of his greatest strengths, which brings us to the bow contest, which I thought was such a great moment of strength. We see him kind of realizing his issues, realizing his guilt, realizing his sins to bring us to this moment that is so iconic within Greek mythology as we see Penelope announces that she will marry whoever can string up Odysseus' bow and fire an arrow through the 12 axe heads. This isn't just some test of strength and ability, this is a test of identity, and throughout the film, Odysseus has questioned whether he still deserves to be king, whether he's still the same man, and the bow answers that question as we watch Odysseus string it up, not because, again, he's not stronger than everyone else in the room, it's because it's still part of who he is, as the bow, in my eyes, kind of becomes a symbol of reclaiming his identity. And I want to go back to Anne Hathaway's performance as Penelope Penelope in this moment because I think it's kind of underrated because it's obviously action-packed. But going back to what I loved about this scene is Nolan suggests that Penelope already suspected the truth that her husband was there, right? She realized he was him long before she set up the bow contest. It wasn't for her, it was actually for everyone else in the room, right? She's forcing the truth into the open. She's allowing Odysseus, her husband, who's returned, to reveal himself on his own terms. And again, I talked about it a little bit, but the action set piece as we see Odysseus take on the suitors is unlike most action scenes because I think the violence feels earned in this moment. Every death represents years of suffering finally ending. We see Odysseus' son having his moment to become his own man, and he fights for his own life. We see the loyal servants reclaim their home, and we just see so much epicness and just so many great moments. It was truly a moment I will remember because it all came full circle. We see these moments of just the camera lingers on the cost. These men were guests at one point, but now they're corpses, and justice comes with bloodshed. Listen, man, just as we see throughout the battles with all the creatures, seeing Odysseus take out the suitors was such an exhilarating moment. Now, as we come to the end of this story, we talk about the moment here where Odysseus walks away from the throne, walks away from the kingdom, and you're wondering to yourself, why does he do that? This is another example of a departure from Homer's poem. In the original, Odysseus reclaims his throne. His journey is complete. But Nolan, once again, wants to go a little bit deeper and ask some of the harder questions. Can someone who has experienced this much trauma ever truly go back to the life they left behind? And his answer is no. Odysseus realizes that reclaiming power isn't what he actually wants. He spent 20 years fighting, lying, killing, surviving. He's tired, but more importantly, he's understood that Ithaca doesn't need the warrior anymore. It needs a future, and that future is his son. By stepping aside, Odysseus performs perhaps the greatest act of heroism. Not defeating monsters, not winning wars, but it's letting go. And for me, that's what makes this ending just elevate the entire experience. Most epics conclude with victory, but Nolan concludes with acceptance. Odysseus finally understands that being a hero doesn't mean holding on to power forever. Sometimes being a hero means knowing when it's time to pass it on. He leaves not because he failed, but because he's finally found peace with the man he has become. And in doing so, Christopher Nolan transforms one of history's oldest stories into something deeply modern. A meditation on trauma, healing, forgiveness, and the courage it takes to move forward when you can never truly go back. If you made it this far into the breakdown, which I appreciate you all watching or listening, you've probably realized that The Odyssey isn't really about monsters. It isn't really even about getting home. Instead, Christopher Nolan uses the Greek mythology as a framework to explore something far more universal, and that being, what does war do to the human soul? That's why every creature, every island, every storm, every encounter feels like it has a purpose beyond spectacle. They're reflections of Odysseus' internal journey. Which leads us into the final stretch of this breakdown, which is tackling the themes that this film handled in such a great way. One being, can you ever go home again, right? If I had to summarize this movie in one sentence, I would probably say that is, you can return home physically, but you can never return to who you were before you left. That idea echoes throughout almost every scene. When Odysseus leaves Troy, he's still viewed as a legendary king. By the time he returns, he's broken, he's haunted, he's questioning every decision he's ever made. Notice that Nolan doesn't portray the journey home as one long adventure, but it becomes a slow process of stripping away Odysseus' identity. Again, he's lost his ships, his friends, his weapons, his status, his reputation, even his own name. But eventually, he's forced to ask himself, who am I when all those things are gone? And that's an incredibly modern question, and one Nolan has explored throughout his career. As we just discussed, the cost of war. One thing I appreciated most about this film is that it refuses to glorify the violence. Yes, the battles are spectacular. They're probably the most violent scenes that I have seen from Christopher Nolan. The practical effects, as we talked about, are incredible. The action sequences are so intense. But after every victory, someone pays the price. The Trojan Horse wins the war but destroys Odysseus' peace. Blinding the Cyclops saves his men but awakens Poseidon's wrath. Escaping Scylla costs lives. Killing the suitors restores Ithaca but leaves another room full of bodies. Every decision carries consequences that may seem obvious, but most epic films eventually celebrate the hero's victories, right? Nolan never lets Odysseus or us as the audience forget what those victories cost him. Again, I go back to Oppenheimer, which I'm such a big fan of that film. In that movie, the bomb ends one war but begins another kind of moral reckoning. And in this story, the Trojan Horse wins Troy, yes, we know that, but Odysseus spends the next 20 years paying for it. Now, I do want to talk about one of the hot topics of this film right now, and that is the interpretation of the Greek mythology. Now, I know for some, they feel like Nolan disrespected the Greek mythology, which, again, everyone has their own opinions on things, and I can understand that side of the story, but I just felt like the way he adapted the Greek mythology was a little bit maybe more accessible to those that aren't too familiar with it. So let's just kind of go through some of the major references, right? We have Athena, who was played beautifully by Zendaya, and I love the representation of how she represents wisdom, but at the same time, she represents accountability. We know in the portion of the film towards the back half, we see his men coming through Troy and killing the people, and we see how Zendaya's character as this civilian gets her head chopped off, and we see Athena is in the form of Zendaya's civilian, and we see again that's the accountability, it's the guilt that he carries. I love that representation of Athena. She's constantly forcing Odysseus to confront his own choices rather than simply rewarding him. We talked about Poseidon earlier on, and he isn't just simply angry, he represents consequences. Nature itself refuses to forgive. No matter how intelligent Odysseus is, some actions can't be undone. You think about the blind prophet. He represents truth, not hope, not fear, truth. His prophecy doesn't change fate, but it simply prepares Odysseus to accept it. Circe, rather than just being a witch, she represents transformation. She forces characters to reveal who they are becoming internally. You have Scylla and Charybdis. Those monsters symbolize impossible choices. Every leader eventually faces situations where no outcome is completely good. The Sirens, they represent temptation through memory. Not greed, not power, but longing. They weaponize nostalgia. You have Argos. In Greek mythology, Argos always symbolizes loyalty. Nolan extends this into something, again, universal, which is love that survives time. Now, going back to a statement I mentioned all the way back when this began, why only Christopher Nolan could make this version of The Odyssey. This is where I think the film becomes something truly special. Anyone can direct monsters, anyone can direct great battle sequences, but few filmmakers could turn Homer's epic into such a intimate meditation on identity and trauma. If you think about Nolan's career, the themes have been building towards this project for decades. Memento explored memory, The Prestige explored obsession, The Dark Knight questioned heroism, Inception explored guilt buried deep within the subconscious. One of my all-time favorite films, Interstellar, argues that love can transcend time and distance. Dunkirk showed survival from 3 different perspectives. And then you have Oppenheimer, which examined an unbearable weight of changing history, which brings us to the Odyssey and brings it all together with all these ideas of memory, identity, time, sacrifice, legacy, survival, guilt, fatherhood, the cost of greatness. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say like this is a brand new side of Nolan. There were some things I didn't know he had in his bag, like the horror elements, which I loved, but it felt like everything he's learned over the past 25 years has culminated into this one film. And that right there is why I walked away thinking that this may very well be his true masterpiece. What makes the Odyssey endure after nearly 3,000 years isn't about the spectacle, it's about the humanity. We've all experienced moments where we wondered if we've changed too much, if we can ever go back, if people can still recognize us, right? If we recognize ourselves. Christopher Nolan understands that those questions are truly timeless. That's why the story still resonates today. Not because of mythology, because of emotion. Odysseus doesn't defeat the Cyclops or Poseidon or the Sirens. His greatest victory was learning to forgive himself. And that's a far more difficult journey than crossing any ocean. So that is my complete breakdown of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. Which brings us to the million-dollar question. I want to hear from you all. What did you think of Nolan's biggest change to the ending, to the story, to the mythology? Did you like the decision to have Odysseus step away from the throne, or would you have preferred a more faithful adaptation to Homer's epic? If you all are watching this here on YouTube and enjoyed this breakdown, I would really appreciate it if you left a like, if you can hype this video up, because this was maybe the biggest video I have done from a script perspective, preparation, and everything in between. So I would appreciate it again if you all can like, hype up the video, share your thoughts again in the comments below. And I always hear love in your thoughts. So again, let's continue in the comments. And I would love it if you all could consider sticking around with the channel, man. I cover everything from movie reviews, Indian explained videos, deep dives, rankings, some of the biggest news in film and television. So if that sounds like the kind of things you all like to take in on a daily basis, I would love for you all to come and join the community by subscribing to the channel today. If you all are listening to this via Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or wherever you all get your podcasts from, I thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to follow the podcast so you never miss a new episode. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, leaving me a 5-star review is the best way to support the show and help more movie fans discover it. As always, I thank you all for watching or listening. Don't forget to stay safe. Don't forget that you all are awesome. And I will see you all on the next breakdown.